My presentation will discuss how in the acts of the Eastern Martyrs, how they reflected the views both of the main characters as well as the historians, hagiographers. I make this distinction that one is, and this is a picture from the Syrian manuscript, which keeps the largest collection of these martyrs' acts, and the other is Byzantine manuscript, that is the translation into Greek, and these martyrs of the East were included, their martyrdoms were put into these hagiography. Well, what shall we discuss? First and foremost, when we speak about Mazdeism, or rather what we call Zoroastrianism, we should immediately make a distinction between two phenomena, two things. Our religious studies perception of Zoroastrianism, of Mazdeism, is like something like monotheistic religion with some dualistic flair that has to do with a tradition, a very ancient Aryan tradition and historic idea, how this religion evolved with time, how it built into political and social structure of the Syrian society, and how it evolved into something that would be an element of identity in late and ancient times of the personality of people who lived there. A well-known book by Kumuna, and how Greek traditions thanks to the context of the Greeks, this gave rise to these contexts, to this Zoroaster as the wise man, one of the Magi, who, this wise man, this Pandit, who is pseudo-Zoroaster, pseudo-Ostanes, pseudo-Histasp, and this is certainly the influence of Pythagoras, and this has nothing to do with this, but it has to do with how the image of Zoroastrianism evolved in European tradition, whereas it has to do with, in some way or other, it's clear, with how first they became to be widely accepted these terms of magician, magi, which originally had a very different meaning, but they were religious and socially they were a caste in its own right. They were stratum in society, some sorts of Brahmins, if you can put it this way, who tried to implant these rites into public mind, but after it went through Greco-Roman filter, instead it evolved into something too close to what we call magic. And besides, in the perception of Western people, of Western culture, especially in the Western part of the Roman Empire, many elements of Mazdeism were associated with something that was already known to them, something of the Near East, of the ethnic religions like Ormazd, was associated with all the gods corresponded to the Roman pantheon. So in late classical times, the Zoroastrianism stopped being, to a great extent, stopped being perceived as something like, as a kind of link to these antique Zoroaster and something that penetrated this mythical wise men. Instead, new phenomena arose. Firstly, because of the influence of with the Jews that gave rise to what is known in research as something Judaic Zoroaster, or if you will, attempts to identify Zarathustra with some prophets, some biblical prophets, or some characters in the Bible, be they Jezekiel, Shet, and later on, when we see Syriac literature rise, this literature to a great extent will be influencing the hagiographies, and we can see that in Syriac literature during starting, say, with the 4th till the 12th, 13th century, when this active writing was on, we see Avesta that evolves, including the story of Zarathustra, that includes all sorts of stories, something that is not typical of Zoroastrianism, for example, that he was eaten by a wolf, for example, or whatever. A classical topic was something, the link or the connection between the magicians and the Chaldeans. They are perceived as some kind of continuation, if you will, of the Chaldee or Chaldeans that we see in the Older Testament, and these astronomers of Babylon, somehow they were incorporated into these magicians, the way at least they were perceived by. And in the Jewish environment, this is where we saw the rise of the legend of Zoroastrian as some kind of variety of a myth about Nimrod. So it is some kind of riches that are rising from the Jewish tradition. It has to do with the Jewish reception, or when the Jews were first exposed to Zoroastrianism in late classical times. And the culmination of this time, or something that anteceded it, was the New Testament Magi, or les trois rois, that were not magicians at all, in the sense this word was used earlier. In the New Testament, this word is used as with a certain share of other meanings. And of course, the story about these 3 kings, as they're known, or 3 magicians, as they're translated into Russian, it has to do with this legend of the birth of the god in Zoroastrianism. This gave rise to that many Syriac writers became to recognize Zoroastrianism as some kind of something that has divine truth, reflects. Otherwise, how could these kings get to know about the star? Well, Syriac writers, I'll be very brief here. Well, heresiologists are mentioning them in some way or another. The main text, which is regrettably lost, this is the text of Theodore of Mopsuet, that in his excerpt of Photius, we only see it, we only preserve it in this excerpt, but was translated into Syriac, and that was something that was read by. Well, there is a small fragment also that is available that criticizes Zoroastrianism, which has in some way influenced, or at least has to do with the geographic ties. Heresiologist Theodor Barkonai also has another short fragment. Again, he seems to be poorly aware of how things stood there, but the Syriac writers certainly impacted the early Armenian writer Yeznik Kochpatsi, which in his composition known sometimes it is translated as about God or about heresies, also reflects. What is critical about these ideas? Zoroaster seems to have invented some kind of Zuruam, whom he also calls fortune, Utyuhin, which begat or must and Satan. This is a myth, as we know, which is somebody think are still relevant. Shageta saying this was something that was invented by the polemists, but whatever. There is some kind of unionist reading and a way to interpret this date in this way. Then they are criticizing Hvieto Dat, or this is the teaching that permits marriage between close related people or even makes them desirable, which is perceived by their sources as incest. And then these authors call it polytheism. They accuse it of worshipping material elements such as water, fire, and others. And as well, we can marginally see accusations of Zoroastrianism of that Mazdeis think that a king or a Shah is considered to be a god and they worship him as a god. In the best known excerpt by Johann Bar Penkai, that was several times published, they also highlight the link with Chaldeans, but they seem to be saying, what can we say about Chaldeans or those who evolved from them? They are Zoroastrianisms. They worship the fire, they also have this. These are silly things which they are saying. And so we see that in scientific literature, there are several polemic motives, and then we're trying to see how these polemics. So we think that from the very start, for Byzantines, they got familiar saying,
he martyred thousands and thousands of people because they were loyal to Christ. In 18th century, famous librarian Asiamani opened this famous thing, and then Paul Bijan, it was 19th century, he published Acta et Sanctorum, then Bijan published the second collection, and we see here the literature that reflects interest to this Persian This is how the Syrian and Persian martyrs appear as certain corpus of martyrdom acts, and we can see early acts of the 4th century, acts of 5th century, and few documents of the 6th century. This reflects the death of certain Persian Christians from the hands of Zoroastrianism followers. All these deeds are the Persian-Roman wars are ongoing, and we know that it happens before Arabic invasion. After Rome becomes Christian, the idea of protection of Christians was used everywhere, and they were saying like Christian emperor protects Christians everywhere, but it didn't mean anything because Christians were still killed. In the 5th century, Maruta de Marfercat appeared, and he gathered, he was writing the books about martyrs, and probably it was in Marfercat, he gave to be translated, and that's how they appeared in Byzantine tradition. And from with his help, the main idea was the great persecution in the 4th century and its reasons. In today, the science considers that the main reasons for political reasons for this big persecution, refusal of the Christians to perform different duties to their state. And here I sent you to the book, The State of the Great Mixture by Richard Penn. He heavily criticized all the reasons of this persecution, and it evoked to life other persecutions that they were there in the 5th and 6th century. This great persecution includes different issues, different documents. It is Güchterstaat documents that my friend Dmitry Afinogenov dedicated his thesis to this martyr. And you see here different other martyrs. I would love to draw your attention especially to Marmaina, Ayatallaha, Akepsima, and his daughter and others. According to Byzantine tradition, all these martyrs became heroes. And what do we see here? In these tables, we see objectively some issues. The martyrs refuses to participate in Mazdeism ceremonies. They break holy places and they put away their fires. One of the priests say, "I will go and I will put down your fire." They actively convert Persian people and they refuse to pay taxes. Also, we have the criticism of cosmologic myth that is kind of evolution. They criticize the ash, what is called in Armenian, it is called Mahrapasht, the veneration of Mahrapasht. And they criticize the veneration of Sun and Patkara. As we can see, we have here certain dialogue with polemic Syrian literature, and I'm more interested in the first part of this table as historical part. And the second part of this table is what we see in the memoirs. So the most popular is martyrdom of Mar Petion and his friends. Mar Petion starts living on the mountain of Bisutun, and he converts not only aristocracy, but also he turns the Zoroastrianism priest, and they together live on the holy mountain, and there is secondary sacralization as a place of the heroism of these martyrs. This way, they compromise the fact that the mountain belongs to Valashfar. It turns out that Christians just live on this holy mountain. Then, when former Zoroastrianism people that were converted by Petion we see that they criticize Zurvanism cosmology, and we hear that we see that at the same time with this life is of very high status. It turns out that the author of this work knew Mazdeism really well. They ignore rituals, ritual of purity, ritual of taking and giving. They purposefully ignore certain rituals and pretend there are no such rituals. Ardalia, where people are tortured, not to torture or not to punish him, just, for example, a person is put in the boiling water, and if nothing happens to him, that means that the person is right. And this procedure, Pasacht и Паден, in Zoroastrianism, didn't have any special idea. It was just a procedure for everybody in Zoroastrianism. Catholicos Simeon Barsabae says that he says, your God is no good. He is not God at all. And they say that Sun, Shemsha, considered to be God in Dossier Marpusai. It is also said that you say this converted person says that moon, fire, and water are the sons of Varmusta, but we do not believe in his brother Saturn. Marmayan says he don't want to worship sun, moon, fire, and Zeus. That's very unexpected. Allah Harabra Zeus, great god Zeus. Probably he means some reception of Zeus or Jupiter that are taken from Babylon pantheon. Most epic from this martyrdom is Dosiedadu and the son of Shakur, and it says that he does not worship Tsar because he is not God. They don't want to worship fire and water. And my conclusion, in short, when we see in Acts criticism of Mazdeism as paganism, Hanputa, on the one hand, it is a tradition of Romanian martyrs' conviction, condemnation, because it was used everywhere, and they corrected, they rebuked it. On the side of martyrs, they see the evolution of Mazdeism. It starts from Shakur the first, when syncretic elements were taken away. So when it is said great God Zeus, it doesn't mean that these martyrs, they knew the remains of syncretism and they criticized it. The second point is Zurvanism. It's a marginal thing. It was an attempt to overcome dualism of, but we see here the problem and it is joined for all polemists. They wanted to criticize something very simple, the idea that God was the father of Saturn, and it is of the one who is worshipped by Mazdeism. And of course, we should understand that in the 2nd century, Mazdeism is kind of sector. There are certain parties, and each of them saw their own way. In the beginning of the 5th century, Mazdeism became more systematized, and we don't see it in later work. And as for criticism of fire worshipping, it is characteristical only for those martyrdoms where the heroes are the former Mazdaic priests, the converted. As for worshipping of elements, the dead element is not a subject for worshipping. And it was all marginal. And the last that I wanted to say, in martyrdoms, we see on the one hand the continuing of the tradition, antique and early Christian tradition, and on the other hand, we see the continuation of polemic tradition, and it is added by the authors, by hagiographers, and of course, martyrs wanted to criticize that was easily to criticize. Thank you for your kind attention.